Hello and welcome to another episode of the RevRx podcast. My name is Chad Potts and I'm your host. In a world that's marked by violence, assassination attempts, school shootings, and violence around every corner, it seems, it helps to have someone like Professor Kenneth Samples to help us think about pain and suffering in a way that enhances our relationship with the world and then also with God. You see, for centuries, Christians have been debating this concept about how can a good God allow evil to happen in this world. And in today's episode, we're going to talk with Professor Kenneth Samples from Reasons to Believe, and he's going to help us as a philosopher, as a theologian. He's going to help us think about some of these things in ways that help us instead of making us jaded and instead of making us discouraged. Professor Samples is doing a great job showing people how to think about some of these topics that come up. And it's his life work to help us discover the fact that God is found everywhere, that God is found out in nature, that God is found in science and all of the research that's done in the name of science, that God is found in pain and in suffering, and how he's ultimately drawing us closer to him throughout all of these things. So hang on to your seats. This is going to be an awesome ride as we discuss the age-old problem of good and evil with Professor Kenneth Samples. Thank you so much, Kenneth Samples. What a privilege it is to have you here on the RevRx show today. I appreciate you being here.
Oh, I'm going to enjoy our discussion today. I was looking forward to it.
Well, same here. As we talked just before the show, I'm a man of faith, and I'm also a man of science. And for a large part of my life, I struggled with how to put those things together. And one of the things that you do with Reasons to Believe and some of your individual works as well is revealing God in science. The fact that God and science does not have to be mutually exclusive. Matter of fact, it's not. And just really helping people walk that line. So I appreciate the space that you're in.
Well, I have gone through some of those questions myself. I think of myself as a man of faith and reason, and I love the two books idea that God's given us the book of Scripture, but also the book of nature. And I think that's a powerful metaphor of thinking of faith and reason.
Absolutely. Well, I'd love to get into your story just a little bit. It's a powerful one of how you discovered faith. You were kind of longing, you had this restlessness, and you began your journey early on, maybe in your teenage years. And I'd love to hear kind of how you came to faith, kind of how you became the man you are today.
Well, thank you for that. I was baptized as a Roman Catholic when my parents converted to Catholicism in the early 1960s. So as a 4-year-old, I was baptized Catholic. But my family kind of fell away from their faith a little bit. They had some struggles. And so I was never confirmed in my Catholic faith. I never disbelieved in God, but I didn't do a lot of growing when I was younger. And as you mentioned, I began to think to myself that there was something missing in my life. I thought, well, what is it that makes me restless? And I remember going to the beach in Southern California and looking at the ocean. It just seemed like the ocean really enhanced that sense of who am I and why am I here? What is this world all about? And I thought to myself, well, maybe as a teenager, I started thinking, well, if I met the right young woman, that may give me a greater sense of fulfillment. I played a little bit of baseball in my time, and I thought, well, wow, what if I could become a rich and famous baseball player? Then I'd be totally fulfilled. But the reality is that none of that was really fulfilling. And even some of my favorite baseball players have shared with me that, that doesn't necessarily give you satisfaction in life.
Sure.
So I had kind of what I would call a family catastrophe. I had an older brother, my brother Frank. He was about 10 or 11 years older than me. He got involved in kind of the counterculture of the time, the hippies movement in the 1960s. Unfortunately, he began taking serious drugs, was arrested, and ultimately my brother took his life. And that rocked my world. I
Yeah.
had never had anybody close to me die, and I felt guilty. I felt like, well, how come I didn't do more to kind of reach out to him and give him a greater sense of peace and hope? But I realized I didn't have much of that myself. And I had one night I had an extraordinary dream where I thought I was first I thought I was in a cave. Later I thought it was maybe a cathedral, but I saw the image of I saw a Christ figure, and when he spoke, it was like thunder. And I woke up in the middle of the night. I remember it so distinctly. I was only 19 at the time. I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. And after that, I decided to do a couple things I'd never done before. I went out and bought myself a Bible. I began reading it. It was the New Living Translation, so it was a paraphrase, but I read through it. I remember one time taking my mother to the market. I stayed in the car and I read through the book of Acts at one sitting.
Yeah.
And I began going to Mass every day. And in those days, you could go to Mass at 7 a.m. So I did that every single day. And people began, who knew me, said, wow, your life has really changed. And then I had a major event where I bumped into Walter Martin, who was the original Bible Answer Man.
Mm-hmm.
He became one of my teachers and a mentor. I worked for him for a time. And apologetics just became very important because, Jehovah's Witnesses would knock at my door, and I had skeptical friends. And I remember one time I was working. I was working at a store called Toys R Us here in Southern California.
Yeah.
And I remember I was out in the parking lot shagging carts. It was near Christmas time. And I thought to myself, I had a bit of a crisis of faith. I said to the Lord, I said, Lord, I'm a man of faith and reason. But I said, at school, we study philosophy, we study reason, but we don't talk about faith. And the little church that I had attended, I left the Catholic Church and began attending kind of a charismatic church. And it was a little on the anti-intellectual side. And I told the Lord, I said, Lord, at church, we talk about faith, but we don't talk about reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I was a man without a country.
Wow.
Fortunately, I had some Christian professors who said, Ken, you need to read St. Augustine. You need to read Anselm.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to realize that God had revealed himself in two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature.
Yeah.
It's not the two books like Islam or Mormonism. God has revealed himself in nature, and I began to see that I could study philosophy, I could study history, I could study science, and that God was the author behind them. And that really transformed my life. It transformed my career. I'm grateful for God's grace, and I'm thankful for him hearing my prayers when they were so awkward when I was I was a young teenager.
Yeah, I love that. And the reason that I relate to that so much is because I went through many of those same moments as well. Realizing that at school, you talked about reason, you talked about science, you talked about, nature, but it was not with any sort of faith slant whatsoever.
Right.
And then at church, you talk about faith, but it's almost anti-reason. Faith is the evidence in things unseen. Well, you're right. You've got a foot in both worlds. So how in the world do they relate?
Yeah.
And the thing that you said that struck me the most was you realized that God was the author of it all. And I absolutely love that. That's what I have kind of come to grasp. No, I wouldn't have been able to say that so eloquently as you just did, but that's exactly what I came to realize too. And I remember I was taking biology, and it was a Christian school. That's the funny thing about it. But the scientists that were teaching these courses and the professors, they didn't bring their Christianity into the classroom.
I see.
And so very much teaching about, the evolution of man and the origin of man and all that. I'm like, how do I reconcile this? And then realizing that God's the author of it all. God, I love the 2-book illustration. I think that's really going to help a lot of people, and I find a lot of value in that as well. God gave us his written work in the Bible, and God gives us his handiwork with nature, and he's
It
the
is.
author of it all.
It's so liberating because at that point, when I began to realize that, I came to the conclusion that all truth is God's truth.
Yeah.
And that truth was not something I needed to be afraid of, that the closer I got to truth, the closer I would get to God.
Yeah.
And it liberated me, where I could study philosophy and compare it and contrast it with my faith. So, yeah, your story and my story are very similar in that way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. You have several books and resources that I've found helpful through the years. And so when I had the opportunity to reach out to you and ask you about joining me today, I was so privileged when you agreed to it. And one of the things that you've written a lot about that I'd love to kind of delve into today is the problem of good and evil. And you could say it a couple ways. You could say the problem of evil or the problem of good. But it's the problem of good and evil. And what I mean by that is this. We're recording this here early September 2024. We're 2 days after a school shooting here in Georgia, near where I'm from.
Sure.
And, unfortunately, this is all too common in our world today.
Yeah.
But it brings up almost every time this issue of why would a good God allow evil such as that to happen?
Sure.
And, that's one problem that I think Christians have been wrestling with for years, right? It's one of the most challenging questions of our faith. And so I'd love to, maybe it's a can of worms, but I don't know anyone who I'd rather have this conversation with than you. So can you kind of walk us down that path and give us your viewpoint of the good and evil debate?
Well, you're exactly right, Chad. The problem of evil is kind of a perennial challenge. I mean, even 500 years before Christ, people like Plato and Aristotle wrestled with the question of, why is there good in the world and why is there evil in the world? And
Sure.
I think that this is an issue that is difficult, but I think it's one that is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I kind of think about it is, if there's evil in the world, then we must live in a moral universe. Because if there was no good, there couldn't possibly be any evil. And so, in this sense, I think that evil depends upon good in a way that goodness doesn't depend upon evil. If there is an event in the world, and certainly these school shootings have become almost a common experience, think of the pain and the sorrow of losing these young people. Well, we know that there is an evil. We know these actions are deeply immoral. And I think at that point we realize that evil, in some sense, has to depend upon good. I say to my atheist friends, don't you also have a problem? You have the problem of the good.
Yeah.
Where does goodness come from? If God doesn't exist, it might seem more reasonable to conclude that there is no ultimate goodness. So why would these things necessarily bother you? What's interesting, Chad, too, is that Christians have tackled this. Some of the great Christian thinkers through the centuries have tackled this.
Yeah.
St. Augustine said, for example, that evil seems like a parasite that lives on the host of goodness. There's this dependence, and it's eating away at moral goodness. Others have said that God has a reason for the evil that he allows, and we can kind of unpackage some of that. I mean, how would God give people a sense of responsibility, a sense of freedom, if he didn't take the risk that we might misuse our freedom and commit evil actions? I also find it interesting that there are other church fathers like Irenaeus, who said, he's a 2nd century church father. He said that God uses pain, suffering, and evil to build our soul, to transform who we are. And again, these school shootings are so horrific. We've had a number of them here where I live as well.
Yeah.
But I would say this, that I like vacations, I like entertainment, I like having fun. But, Chad, I've never learned anything deeply profound.
Mm.
It's always through the challenging times of life. It was the loss of my brother. 20 years ago, I had a life-threatening illness, and I wouldn't want to go through it again, but it transformed me.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you a little story. And you're a pharmacist, you can relate to this. I contracted a bacterial infection in my right lung. So I had a large lesion in my right lung, and it went to my brain, and I had 6 abscess brain lesions. Later, my doctor told my wife that the mortality rate was like 80%.
Wow.
And I remember being in the hospital. I was laying on a gurney. They were going to do another MRI and look at my brain. And one of the nurses wheeled a patient in a wheelchair, and our eyes met. I didn't want to talk to him. I wanted to lay there and feel sorry for myself. But our eyes met, and he said to me, Chad, I discovered, my doctor told me I have a 6-pound cancer in my stomach. And I just looked at him and I said, you know what? I said, friend, you and I are both in a real hard spot. And I said, I think the only thing we can do is put our trust in the Lord. And he started weeping, and he said to me, I want that.
Wow.
And almost as quickly as we had that brief conversation, the nurse came and whipped him away, and I never saw him again. But it is through pain and suffering that transforms our character. I began to realize that I needed to be much more empathetic to people. I realized, being hospitalized for a month, Chad, that there are people, it's all they can do to set up in their bed, to make their way through life. And I began to realize that evil, pain, and suffering are difficult things, but God is so great. He is so powerful. He is so wise and so good that he can bring good out of evil.
Yeah.
And look at the crucifixion of Christ, the greatest injustice, and God brings good out of evil. So those are some of the ways in which Christians have kind of thought through. And of course, maybe one final word, there's going to come a time when the Lord will bring this universe to a close. And that's when all of us will stand before God. And God's going to take all those crooked straws and he's going to make them straight. And all the injustice in life is going to be reversed.
Yeah.
And that to me is a very encouraging word. That's a hope we have that other worldviews don't have.
Yeah. So, even though we struggle with these things now, there is coming a day. There is coming a time when all will be made right. And that does give us great hope. And so one of the things when we think about evil, one of the things I think about is that, that's not, our world is not as it should be, right? And I think we have to understand, that God didn't create evil, right? Is that a good way to think about that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, again, one of my favorite thinkers is, again, St. Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
Augustine, for a time, was in kind of a religious cult, but they thought, okay, we have a solution to the problem of evil. There's 2 gods, an evil God and a good God. Later, Augustine thought, why was I ever attracted to that? But what Augustine came to is that God did not create evil. As a Christian, he said, God did not create evil. Evil is like a parasite. Evil is like a cavity in your teeth. It is the absence of the enamel. It is the absence of the goodness that should be there. So God didn't create evil. Evil results from the good thing that God gave to people, and that we can be morally responsible. We can make real choices in life. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not so much, I like the way you worded that. It's not so much the presence of evil, but it's the absence of good.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And I see, I think, Chad, this really turns the discussion into a new direction. And I really do think that atheists have to come to grips with when people don't believe in God, and yet they think certain things are evil. I think if God doesn't exist, I don't know how you would explain goodness, and I don't know how you could have ultimate evil.
Sure.
So they have that tension. I think every worldview has to address this issue. And And I'm very happy and pleased that some of the great Christian thinkers through the century have not shied away from this. They
Yeah.
have taken it and dealt with it. I had the great pleasure of meeting uh, a lady named, what is her name now? Johnny Erickson Tada.
Yeah.
She has a remarkable story. When she was a young woman, she dived into the ocean, I think, and broke her neck. She became a paraplegic. She has this incredible ministry reaching out to people. I mean, she is a paraplegic. She's a writer. She's a thinker, a lecturer. And she said at one of her talks that I was at, she said that God allows what he hates in order to demonstrate or to lead to what he loves.
Mm.
God allows evil, but it is always leading toward that point where God will transform these things. And I like to tell that to people. I say, look, I know you're struggling. I know times are difficult, but the good Lord is going to make all of this right.
Yeah. That's really, really powerful. And when you think about it, what you're facing, suffering, pain, evil, that's not good. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of good. It's the absence of good, as we've submitted.
And I would say this to you with your background in medicine.
Uh-huh.
I remember talking to my doctor, and people who struggle with neuropathy, they can't feel pain.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes a very serious problem. So
yeah.
Pain is often in the body an indication, hey, there's something wrong. Something needs to be addressed. So not all pain is necessarily a bad thing.
Sure. And but realizing that even though it can have a purpose, and even though we're not calling it good, what we are saying is that God is so good that he can use that absence of good to make something good. And I know that's not really elegant, but I think that speaks in that we serve a good God who, despite the evil, is still working and is still bringing good in this world.
And in the history of Christian thinking about the problem of evil, there have been defenses and there have been theodicies. So theodicy would be a way of making sense of how could God be good and all powerful and all loving and yet allow evil.
Yeah.
And it's just as you've noted that there are many things. I mean, let's take these terrible school shootings. God gave people certain capacities. He's given us an intelligence. He's given us an ability. And these people have taken those good things God gave them and they've used them for evil purposes.
Yeah.
And, again, a lot of times some of my skeptical friends would say, well, why doesn't God just get rid of all evil? And I said, yeah, get rid of all of us.
Yeah.
Because if we have the capacity to choose evil, the only way to do it is to eliminate all of us.
Wow.
And, so a lot of times, the smarter, the more gifted people are, the more skilled they are, the greater good they can do. But in contrast, it means they can also do great evil.
I like what you brought up about the capacity of evil in all of us. And that's maybe a different thread of thought, but I'd like to go there for just a minute.
Sure.
Because, I think we draw this line, and it's arbitrary, of what constitutes evil,
Yes.
What is evil? At what point does something become evil? And, if we're looking at it and if we're kind of defining that as the absence of good, is sin itself evil? Depending on how you define sin. But, if I'm intentionally choosing to disobey God, is that evil? And, is that on some spectrum versus, all right, we'll call the other side the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
We don't see ourselves as evil, though. Can you help us think about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you've really put your finger on something very important. When you look to Scripture, sin is defined in a couple different ways. Sin is to miss the mark. God has set a life of holiness and righteousness. We miss the mark.
Right.
Probably the predominant definition of sin is to be a commandment breaker. God has these laws and we violate them, we break them. I think it's fair to say that sin is anything that is contrary to the holy character of God.
Yeah, that's good.
And so when we violate that, we commit sin, we commit evil. And by the way, Chad, I found an article by a leading atheist philosopher. His name is Keith Parsons, very sharp. Probably the only person I ever saw that may have either matched or beat William Lane Craig in debate. I mean, this guy is very sharp because Bill Craig is a brilliant Christian thinker. He wrote an article about 10 years ago, and he said, usually I'm attacking religion, and he says, I have no interest in Christian apologetics. He said, there's one thing Christianity gets right, and that's sin. That's original sin. Mm-hmm. And I was just blown away. He said, you know what? There is a fundamental flaw in all human beings. There is, and, he illustrated it by referring to the Nazis and things of that nature. But I thought, wow, I don't know if Dr. Parsons has realized what a concession he has made. That the Bible really does, it explains the person in the mirror.
Yeah.
And that's what attracted me all those years ago. I thought, wow, my Christian faith makes sense of my yearnings and my longings, my sense of, searching. But it also makes sense that I am a sinner. I need forgiveness. I need fulfillment. And I thought, wow, I wonder if Dr. Parsons realized how much he was giving away when he said Christians can explain the human condition. And I think that's such an important idea.
I do too. And we tend to not recognize that in ourselves. We're quick to point it out in others, but maybe not so quick for thinking that we're in the same boat as them. But just a reminder, hey, there's a capacity for evil in all of us. And so you're right. If God were to eliminate evil, then there'd be no one left.
That's exactly right. And therefore, what might be some of the reasons God allows pain and suffering and evil? And, and again, I mean, I used to think my father was a combat soldier in the Second World War. And I thought, well, the courageous people are people like soldiers and policemen and firemen. When I was hospitalized, Chad, I realized, no, there's a lot of courageous people who live day to day with difficulties and struggles. And after that, I realized, boy, I wanted to know the people at our church who were sick. I wanted to visit them. I took a greater sense of, these people need my encouragement and my support. And so I like to think God brought empathy out of the difficult times in my health experiences.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing too. So I'm in it. I'm in healthcare, of course.
Yes,
and I see it from that perspective. But recently, I've my whole life I've been healthy, never been hospitalized.
Yeah.
But I started having some medical issues, and so I've been hospitalized a couple times in the last couple of years. Mm. And I've really developed, like you said, an empathy towards those that deal with chronic disease, chronic pain on an everyday basis. And while my affliction was temporary, that's not always the case. And so now I've seen healthcare from both sides. I've seen it from the practitioner side, and now I've seen it from the patient side.
Wow.
And that's changed the way that I practice pharmacy. That's also changed my role in pastoral care.
Chad, it's a powerful point. In the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world in which Christianity was birthed, people began to see a difference with Christians. Mm-hmm. They would open hospitals, soup lines, orphanages to care for children who didn't have parents. Even hospice came out of a Christian context. Well, the Lord isn't going to heal you, but we can comfort you.
Yeah.
And I think, as we're talking about apologetics and arguments, sometimes people want to know, hey, if I become a Christian, I have a God who loves me and cares for me, and I'm part of a community. So our actions also become part of our reasoning and arguments in favor of the Christian worldview. So I love it that you're involved in the medical field and you can look at it from both perspectives. That's wonderful.
People are broken, people are hurting, and they need the love of Christ. And I believe it's our job to share with them that love. And sometimes that looks like sharing the gospel.
Yeah.
Sometimes that looks like being the hands and feet of Christ right where they are.
Yeah.
And that takes on different forms of all kinds. But yeah, I really like that concept for sure. One of the other things you mentioned is that God doesn't necessarily explain himself to us. And that's a whole different pattern as well, but it's one that's important when we think about this problem of good and evil, realizing that we have finite minds, and the scripture tells us his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so help us kind of think about that a little bit too, if you will, the fact that there is this concept of good and evil, and we have good ideas about how to fix it, but we are human and he is God.
Chad, I'm so glad you brought that up because the Bible, interestingly enough, the Bible talks a lot about the problem of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
You look at the Psalms, there are these laments where the psalmist pounds the table and says, Lord, why am I going through this? And, the book of Romans deals with the problems of evil, saying God works all things together for good for those who love him, those who are called according to his purpose. But, one of the books of the Old Testament deals with evil in a unique way. And it's the book of Job.
Yep.
Here's Job, who is this extraordinary person. He has a great reputation. He has a large family. He's enormously successful. The Lord decides that he will allow Job to be tested by the devil. And Job loses everything. He loses his family. He loses his health. Even his friends ridicule him and tell him, well, you must have done something wrong. Then I think right at the end is the very point that you have eloquently made, Chad, and that is, I think what the Lord finally says to Job at the end is something along these lines. Job, you don't have the intellectual, moral, or spiritual capacity to understand what I'm doing. Humans, as you mentioned, humans are finite. We're limited. God is eternal and infinite. Yeah. I don't think any of us could totally understand what God's purposes are. But Yahweh says to Job, trust me, put your confidence. And that's the very root of our word for faith.
Yep.
Whether it's the noun, pistis, or pistuo, the verb, confident trust in a reliable, trustworthy source.
Yeah.
And the Lord doesn't think that he owes us to explain all these things to us. And that's part of the Christian faith as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Having faith in someone who is trustworthy, even when we can't see the other side. And that doesn't mean the lack of thinking. That doesn't mean the lack of reason.
Right.
But that, I think, is where our faith comes in. We realize our limitations.
Yeah.
And we realize that he has none.
And what's been very helpful to me is my wife. She appreciates my work as a philosopher, but she's not terribly interested in philosophy. But she's taught me so much about faith. She's taught me, Ken, the Lord's in control. When we've had issues with our kids, when we've had financial struggles, she was always that voice of saying, but the Lord's watching over us. And that is such an important thing because, again, sometimes my philosophical arguments, while I think they're coherent, I still have to live day to day in that trusting relationship.
Yeah. Well, I want to circle back around as we kind of wrap up our time here. And one of the things that you said you found in Christ in the early days of your struggles was he's what brought you satisfaction and fulfillment that you were looking for everywhere else. And I see that every day in both of my lines of work.
Yeah.
I see people who are broken, who are longing, who are restless, who realize that there has to be more to life than this, and they just don't know where to look. And so you're right. We look for our family to fill that void. And our families are so important, but they'll never fill that void that God was designed to fill.
That's
We
right.
look to our careers. We look for hobby and leisure. We look for success. We look for all of these things to fill that God-sized hole. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity here at the end to, you're a man who's been influenced heavily by C.S. Lewis, and I have as well. And can you help us just kind of answer the question of what does Christ mean in our daily walk? What is it that fulfills our heart, fulfills our soul, and satisfies us like no other? And
Yeah.
you can let C.S. Lewis help you there if you'd like.
Yeah.
So.
Here I've been influenced by three Christian thinkers. I call them the big three: Augustine, Pascal, and Lewis. And
Yeah.
Augustine says in his great book, The Confessions, he says, Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until we rest in you.
Yeah.
And I began to see that so many years ago that it is the sense, Chad, that God will not allow us to be satisfied in anything other than himself.
Mm.
And that's what I would call painful truth. It's painful when you realize, wow, my career, which I thought was all of this, it's like, wow, it wasn't everything.
Mm.
Or even our families. I mean, I have a wonderful wife, but she can't meet my existential needs. I can't meet her existential needs. C.S. Lewis talked about having desires, that we're longing for something. And that is really the story of my life. It is the argument that I like to present, that God will not allow any of us to be satisfied except in him. It's kind of a severe mercy. He's keeping us tethered to him. He's showing us, you might be this very bright, hotshot pharmacist, but at the end of the day, where is that fulfillment? And I think it's an incredible thing. And I think it's something you can actually test. I tell my skeptical friends, okay, you don't have faith. Why don't you go to church? Why don't you open the Bible and read it? Why don't you put God to the test and see if you can find this rest and peace that you're looking for?
Yeah.
I found it. The Lord reached out to me, and I found that rest and peace. And Chad, I think that's a very powerful, pragmatic argument. It is an argument about the practical, everyday fulfillment of having a satisfying and meaningful life. And think of all the young people outside, coming through that pandemic, how many people are filled with anxiety. They feel a deep sense of longing and a lack of fulfillment. That's where I think the Christian worldview and maybe one of the most important words, hope. God can give you hope and meaning and purpose. So I love that. I'm grateful for Augustine, Pascal, and Lewis, who all got it from the scriptures anyway. That's where it comes,
Yeah. One of his two books.
That's it. Yes.
The book of scripture and the book of nature. So we've come full circle now with all of that. And I love that. That's so good because we need hope.
Yes.
And I say now more than ever, we've always needed hope.
Yes.
But we do need hope today. In a lost and broken world, we need that hope, and Christ gives us that hope. One thing that I like to tell people is, you've tried this, you've tried that, you've tried X, Y, Z. Have you tried Jesus?
Yeah.
And I love that test. Just try it, and I think you'll be surprised.
Amen.
Well, Ken, where can people find out about your work? Tell us a little bit about Reasons to Believe and some things you're up to these days, your blog, great articles on there. How can they connect with you?
Yeah, thank you, Chad. Our website is reasons.org. And of course, I work with a number of scientists, and I kind of bring the philosophy and theology to bear on these types of questions. Mm-hmm. I write a blog called Reflections. We have a podcast called Clear Thinking, and I enjoy being able to talk to and meet some of these scientists and various people, and again, communicate this idea we've been talking about, that God is the author of both books, that we can discover God in science because he's the creator. And I want to tell you how much I've enjoyed this. I hope lots of people will listen to your podcast. You have a nice style, and it's very attractive. So keep it up.
Well, I appreciate it, Ken. Thanks so much for being here. This is really and truly a privilege, and I can't wait for our listeners to glean from your insight, and I just appreciate the work you're doing. It's much needed, and it's a blessing to many, many others. So,
thank you so much.
thank you for listening to the RevRx podcast. We hope you enjoyed what you heard today, and if so, we'd love it if you would hit that subscribe button so that you'll never miss a new episode from us. Also, feel free to leave us reviews and comments, as we'd love to hear from you. Be blessed and be the very best you.